Cheddar is one of the most consumed cheeses in the world, only really beaten by mozzarella. But where does it come from? Was it first made during Roman times? Or perhaps the 12th century during the reign of English King Henry II? Or the 17th under Charles I? Or was it invention of the industrialization of the 18th century? Keep watching to find out. Hey there cheese historians, I'm Julia and welcome to Cheese History, a channel all about the origins, history and impact of cheese. Today we're talking about one of the most widely available cheeses, cheddar. In this video I'm going to focus on what cheddar cheese is and its origins and early history. And because I found so much detail about cheddar that there's no way I can do it justice in just one video, in another video I'll cover how cheddar cheese developed into the cheese that we have today and its more recent history. So buckle up for more than you ever wanted to know about cheddar cheese. Cheddar cheese comes in so many different shapes and sizes today that it's worth briefly looking at what all those cheeses called cheddar are supposed to have in common. Cheddar has become a generic term encompassing a vast range of hard cheeses. According to the US Code of Federal Regulations, any cheese with a moisture content of up to 39% and at least 50% fat in dry matter can legally bear the name. One of the ways to classify cheese is by how much moisture they contain. Under this system there are three types of cheese: soft, semi-soft and hard. Hard cheeses have up to 39% moisture content, semi-soft cheeses have more than 50%, and soft cheeses don't seem to have a set moisture content but have other defining characteristics such as their fat content. Fat content in dry matter is another way to classify cheese. It means the amount of fat relative to the amount of dry matter, which is what will be left over in the cheese if all the moisture was removed. Hard cheeses are dry, so have less moisture and more dry matter, while soft and semi-soft cheeses have more moisture and less dry matter. As cheddar only has to have at least 50% fat in dry matter, there is still a lot of room for variation, as it's possible to have around 70% fat in dry matter and still make a viable cheese. My point is that if we define cheddar as any cheese that has a moisture content of 39% or less and more than 50% fat in dry matter, there are a lot of cheeses that could classify as cheddar. It also doesn't help that under the Code of Federal Regulations, all hard cheeses fall within these parameters of up to 39% moisture and more than 50% fat in dry matter, so this way of defining cheddar isn't very helpful. But if we want to take a narrower definition of what cheddar cheese is, we could look at how the cheese is made. One of the key steps typically considered to be key to making cheddar is cheddaring, which is a process of stacking and turning blocks of cheddar curds to help them grow more acidic, expel more whey, thus lowering the moisture content, and develop the right texture. However, it's possible to make cheddar cheese without cheddaring the curds, as a similar result can be achieved by stirring the curds, which also helps them expel whey, become more acidic, and impacts the texture, but not quite the same way as cheddaring. So the use of cheddaring isn't necessarily helpful either. Is there anything that can help pinpoint what cheddar cheese is and what it's not? From what I can tell, it doesn't look like there is.
Cheddar is all things to all people. It is made in formats ranging from tiny trucklets to 650 pound, 295 kilo blocks. It can be dyed bright orange or left with its natural colour. Some cheddars are allowed to develop a natural rind, while others are bound in cloth or aged in plastic or wax. Cheddar can be sold when it is a few months old or kept for several years, and its texture varies from rubbery and pliant to friable and crystalline. Flavours range from mild and buttery to brothy and savoury, and often feature distinctive acidity or sharpness. Some cheeses may be sulphurous and eggy, others winey or fruity. Although cheddar was originally made with cow's milk, it is now sometimes made with the milk of goats, sheep or buffalo.
So today cheddar cheese has basically become a generic term, and we could define what cheddar cheese is by using the US Code of Federal Regulations definition that is so broad that cheeses that are not considered cheddar could be labelled as cheddar cheese due to having a similar moisture and fat content. We could also define it by how it's made, but there are even disagreements about that, and it's possible to make cheddar cheese without cheddaring. Because cheddar cheese can be so different, I'd love to know what cheddar cheese is like for you, wherever you are in the world, so do leave a comment below. With all this variation in what cheddar cheese is, perhaps we need to turn to its origins to get more of an idea on where it came from, in order to discover what cheese we should consider cheddar today. As with the origins of any cheese, there are a lot of different suggestions floating around about when cheddar cheese originates. Does it go back to the Roman occupation of Britain, or sometime before the 12th century, or maybe the 16th? One thing that's less contentious is where it comes from, because cheddar cheese gets its name from the village of Cheddar in the county of Somerset. So it's a reasonably safe bet that the cheese that we know today developed in the area around Cheddar in Somerset. So we have a location, but when do we start seeing signs of the cheese itself? To avoid confusion, when discussing the town of Cheddar and the cheese which gets its name from that town, I'm going to try and use cheddar to refer to the town and cheddar cheese for the cheese, which means that I'm going to say cheddar cheese a lot to differentiate it from cheddar. It would be easier to say cheddar, but then there would be confusion as to whether I'm talking about the town or the cheese. With any luck, I'll try and be consistent about this throughout this video. Cheddar cheese may be able to trace its roots back to the Roman times, when the Roman army brought their hard cheese-making skills to Britain. While cheesemakers in Cheddar might have benefited from the new techniques introduced by the Romans, either at the time or in the centuries that followed as the skills spread throughout the British Isles, we don't have any records of cheesemaking in Cheddar for 1,000 years after the Romans arrived to know with any certainty that there's a link between the two. And if there is, we have no idea whether it's a direct link of cheesemakers in Cheddar learning from the Romans, or if they learned to make hard cheese from cheesemakers in surrounding villages or counties who learned from the Romans, or from someone else who learned from the Romans. So there's a possibility of a Roman influence, but we don't know enough to really know what that could have looked like. Another claim that's regularly repeated, including by the Cheddar Gorge Cheese Company, who make cheddar cheese in Cheddar, is that cheddar cheese is mentioned in the pipe rolls of Henry II from 1170. Now this claim was a tricky one to track down because the pipe rolls were written in what is basically shorthand Latin, but I believe I found the entry that was used to claim that cheddar was being produced in 1170. It's under the heading for Dorset and Somerset and reads like this. The best sense I can make of this shorthand Latin is that it means that 40 librae were paid for 40 pences of cheese. It turns out that a pencer is a unit for the weight of cheese, which equals about 256 pounds, so 40 pences of cheese is 10,240 pounds. The exact weight of a pound has changed throughout English history, so I'm not going to attempt to convert it into modern pounds or kilograms because I don't know enough about that to do it with any degree of accuracy. However it converts, 10,240 pounds of mass is a lot of cheese, and 40 pounds of currency was a lot of money in 1170. So now that we have some idea of what this entry is saying, we can ask the question, is this cheese cheddar cheese? As we have little information to go on, it's impossible to say anything for certain. It appears that the pipe roll does mention a place that could be Cheddar earlier in the same paragraph, but without knowing a lot more Latin and a lot more about the pipe rolls themselves, I'm not going to make any bold claims about this cheese being mentioned in 1070 definitely being cheddar cheese.
What we call cheddar today, even the name-controlled West Country farmhouse cheddar, is linked but not identical to the cheese made in that region in the 12th century, when history begins to record it. Until the process was standardized closer to our present time, it was more cheese from cheddar than what we would think of as cheddar cheese.
I think the best we can say is that cheese was being made in Somerset in 1170, and likely sometime before that too. It was well enough known that it was being bought by Henry II in large quantities, and it's entirely possible that cheese was being made in the village of Cheddar at this time too, and it could even have made up some of the 40 pences of cheese bought by Henry II. So unlike most other cheese origin claims I've looked at on this channel, which turn out to be bogus or impossible to verify, the claims of cheddar cheese look pretty plausible. So what do we know about cheddar cheese after 1170? By the 16th century, the cheese made in and around the town of Cheddar in Somerset had become known by the name Cheddar. The earliest explicit mention of it that I could find is from William Camden's Britannia, written in Latin in 1586, which was a survey of Britain and Ireland. This is what he has to say about cheddar.
West of Wells, just under Mendeep Hills, lies Cheddar, famous for the excellent and prestigious great cheeses made there, some of which require more than one man's strength to set them on the table, and are of a delicate taste, equaling if not exceeding that of the Parmesan.
So even though cheddar cheese was possibly in existence in 1170, by 1586 it's well established and known for its high quality. They're also really big, as they need more than one person to lift them. The comparison to Parmesan must at least be partially due to the similarity in size between the two, as Parmesan is also a large cheese, usually around 66 pounds or 30 kilograms today. Depending on exactly what Camden means by a delicate taste, this could mean that cheddar cheese at this point is being eaten when it's younger and milder. But equally, the comparison to Parmesan could also suggest that delicate doesn't mean mild, but perhaps something else, maybe a more refined flavour than other cheeses. interpreting descriptions from hundreds of years ago is hard. Cheddar's reputation as an excellent cheese isn't limited to the late 16th century, but continued on into the 17th century as noted by Dalby. The name of cheddar appears for the first time in 1635 as that of a delicacy so much in demand at Charles I's court in London that cheddar cheeses were sold before they were made. We've already seen that Camden explicitly names cheddar cheese in 1586, 49 years before 1635. However, the event Dalby refers to is a really interesting one. At least I think so anyway. For all I know, you're asleep at this point. Anyway, there's an exchange preserved in the Calendar of State Papers from 1635. In an entry dated November 16th, Viscount Conway writes to Lord Poulet and reminds him of a cheese of cheddar he was to send him. Lord Poulet responds at the end of the month to inform Viscount Conway that he has sent to take up all the cheeses at Cheddar for him. He writes again in December that he sends a cheddar cheese and apologises for sending but one. They are wont to be common in that country, till now they are grown to be in such esteem at court that they are bespoken before they are made. So in 1635, cheddar cheese was so popular with the court of Charles I that they were buying cheese that hadn't even been made yet, meaning that no one else had a chance of getting any at all. It wasn't an isolated incident either. A couple of years later in 1639, Irish statesman Sir Philip Perserved corresponded with several relatives trying to get hold of cheddar cheese. The first letter was to his cousin James Perserved on January the 20th, when Sir Philip prays his cousin to bestow what surplus there may be from the rents and the purchase of old cheese of the country, which as he remembers is called cheddar cheese, the supply from Chester being stopped. Also he wishes for a supply of young elm plants. So here, cheddar cheese appears to be the next best when cheese from Chester was available. You may wonder why I included the request for elm plants as well as cheddar cheese. Well, it's because the cheese and the elm plants keep coming up together in Sir Philip's correspondence. Now, I couldn't find out whether James Percival replied to this, but Sir Philip seems to have been determined to get the cheese and the elms, as on December the 1st, 1639, another cousin, Edmund Percival, wrote to Sir Philip. As for cheddar cheese and elms, you had better deal with your tenant, Mr. Dampier, who has an agent always roaming through Somersetshire and could easily procure the plants from Burton and send them to Minehead. Edmund wrote again on June the 6th, 1640, the cheddar cheese and young elm plants shall be sent before Christmas. And then a few months later in September, he had to tell Sir Philip that the cheese would be delayed. At St Paul's Fair, the 25th of January, there will be both Wexford and Dublin barks at Bristow, and then, if not before, I will send you both cheddar cheese and plants. Unfortunately, this date wasn't possible either, as Edmund writes on January 26, 1641. You should have had your cheddar cheese this Paul's Fair, but I dared not venture a winter's journey to those parts. If, please God, I live to see St James's Fair, you shall have them then from Bristol Fair. I'm not sure what happened to the elm plants. Perhaps they got through to Sir Philip, but the cheese didn't. After this letter, I could find no further mention of cheddar cheese, so I have no idea whether Sir Philip ever got the cheddar cheese he asked for some 2 years earlier. Assuming, of course, that Sir Philip wasn't requesting cheddar cheese and elm plants on a regular basis, which he could have been doing. So in the 1630s, cheddar cheese was so popular with the nobility of England that it had to be purchased well in advance and could take years before it got through, if it arrived at all. Its popularity didn't end there though. In 1725, Daniel Defoe published his tour through England and Wales, where he describes large cheddar cheese as the greatest and best kind in England. He also includes a detailed description of the town of Cheddar and their cheese-making practices.
In the Low Country, on the other side of the Mendeep Hills, lies Cheddar, a village pleasantly situated under the very ridge of the mountains. Before the village is a large green, or common, a piece of ground in which the whole herd of cows belonging to the town do feed. The ground is exceedingly rich, and as the whole village are cowkeepers, they take care to keep up the goodness of the soil by agreeing to lay on large quantities of dung for manuring and enriching the land.
So at this point, unless Defoe is exaggerating, the whole town of Cheddar appears to be in the business of dairy herding, and they put a lot of effort into ensuring that their land produces really good grass for their cows. Defoe makes it clear in what he says next that the village doesn't collectively own the herds. Instead, they're grazing their individual herds of various sizes on this common land.
The milk from all the town's cows is brought together every day to a common room, where the persons appointed or trusted for the management measure every man's quantity and set it down in a book. When the quantities are adjusted, the milk is all put together, and every meal's milk makes one cheese, and no more, so that the cheese is bigger or less as the cows yield more or less milk. By this method, the goodness of the cheese is preserved, and without all dispute, it is the best cheese that England affords, if not the whole world affords.
Defoe clearly had a very high opinion of cheddar cheese. It's interesting that he describes the process of combining the milk from all the villagers' herds to create one cheese, the size of which depends on how much milk the cows will give on a particular day. This makes sense as cows produce different amounts of milk throughout the milking season. The cheese created would have varied depending on the size, as bigger cheeses take longer to age. He goes on to give us an idea of how big these cheeses were.
As the cheeses are by this means very large, for they often weigh 100 weight, sometimes much more, so the poorer inhabitants, who have but few cows, are obliged to stay the longer for the return of their milk, for no man has any such return till his share comes to a whole cheese, and then he has it, and if the quantity of his milk delivered in comes to above a cheese, the overplus rests in account to his credit, till another cheese comes to his share, and thus every man has equal justice. And though he should have but one cow, he shall in time have one whole cheese. This cheese is often sold for 6p to 8p per pound, when the Cheshire cheese is sold but for 2p to 2p halfpenny.
Cheshire cheese was another popular cheese in the 18th century, so it's not surprising to see it mentioned here in comparison to cheddar cheese. Clearly it was a point of pride that cheddar cheese fetches the higher price. It's likely that cheddar cheese has quite ancient roots, possibly developed from cheese-making techniques brought to Britain by the Romans. It may also have been part of the Somerset cheese purchase made to Henry II in 1170. In the early centuries of its existence, cheddar cheese was likely limited to Somerset and the surrounding counties, because it was costly and difficult to transport it too far. Over time it increasingly made it to the courts of monarchs and the tables of the wealthy, but they would have been more willing to pay the extra cost of transportation. This had changed by the 18th century when the roads improved and cheddar cheese was set to be unleashed upon the world. Towards the end of the 18th century, it was as popular as Cheshire, another widely known and eaten cheese at the time. And that is where we're going to have to leave cheddar cheese, because there's still a lot of change and development ahead in its history before we get to the cheddar cheese dominated world that we live in today. And this video is already too long. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. And you can support Cheese History over on Patreon. A special thanks to all my patrons for all their support. You guys are the best. And I'll see you next time for the continuation of the history of cheddar cheese.